Hi guys, welcome to this video on Act 1 from Inspector Calls. And in this video we're going to be looking at the opening section of the play, right up to the point where the inspector arrives. Now in this section we're introduced to the characters of Mr. Birling, Mrs. Birling, Gerald, Sheila and Eric. And we find them sat around a dinner table having a lovely family meal celebrating the engagement of Sheila and Gerald. Now within the introduction of these characters we get to see aspects of their personality, we get to see their values, particularly thinking about that capitalist versus socialist, we talked about in the previous video. We're going to see that as a family, they generally have very capitalistic views. We're also going to see how they behave with each other, how they interact, and how they behave within their relationships. Now this section of the play is also really important, because as with the sign of Four and Macbeth, we need to think about how are these characters changing. And this section of the play shows how the characters have been behaving for pretty much their whole lives up to now. That will change when the inspector arrives and begins his interrogations. So please make notes on how the characters are behaving, their personalities and attitudes at this point of the play. This section of the play also introduces Priestley's use of dramatic irony. To clarify, dramatic irony is when the audience knows something the characters don't. And there are several points where dramatic irony is deployed, particularly with the character of Mr. Birling, and it's effective because the play was set quite a while before it was actually written. This section of the play deals with themes of class, gender, and introduces the idea of old versus young. And just before we start listening to the play, I think it's important to note that there are some differences between the text and the play version that you're going to listen to. Where they skip lines, just try and jump ahead a little bit, find where they're talking from and continue following your text. So before we look at the annotation, let's have a little listen to this section of the play.
Give Mr. Croft some port.
Thank you.
You ought to like this port, Gerald. It's exactly the same as your father gets.
Well, it'll be all right.
An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley.
The Governor prides himself on being a good judge of port. I don't pretend to know much
With
about
Toby Jones as Inspector Gould.
I should jolly well think not, Gerald. I'd hate you to know all about port, like one of those purple-faced old men.
Now then, Sybil, you must take a little tonight, Special occasion.
Yes, go on, Mummy. You must drink our health.
Very well, then. Just a little. Thank you.
Allow me, Mrs. Birling.
Thank you. All right, Edna. I'll ring from the drawing room when we want coffee. Probably in about half an hour.
Yes, Mum.
Oh, well, this is very nice, isn't it? Very nice. Good dinner too, Sybil.
Lovely.
Don't you agree, Gerald?
Absolutely
Arthur, you're not
first
supposed to
class.
say things
no.
like that.
Come, Sybil. Treating Gerald like one of the family. I'm sure he won't object.
Go on, Gerald. Just you object.
Wouldn't dream of it. In fact, I insist upon being one of the family now. I've been trying long enough, haven't I? You know I have.
Of course she does.
Yes, except for all last summer when you never came near me and I wondered what had happened to you.
And I've told you I was awfully busy at the works all that time.
Yes, that's what you say.
Now, Sheila, don't tease him. When you're married, you'll realise that men with important work sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I have.
I don't believe I will, so you be careful, Gerald.
Oh, I will.
Now, Eric, what's the joke?
I don't know, really. Suddenly I felt I just had to laugh.
You're squiffy.
I'm not.
Now, stop it, you two. Arthur, what about this famous toast of yours?
Yes, of course. Well, Gerald, it's a pity Sir George and Lady Croft can't be with us, but they're abroad, so it can't be helped. I'm going to tell you frankly that your engagement to Sheila means a tremendous lot to me. Just the kind of son-in-law I've always wanted. Your father and I have been friendly rivals in business for some time now, though Crofts Limited are both older and bigger than Birling and Company. Well, now you brought us together. And perhaps we may look forward to the time when Crofts and Birlings are no longer competing, but are working together for lower costs and higher prices.
Here, here.
Arthur, I don't think you ought to talk business on an occasion like this.
Neither do I. All wrong.
Quite so. What I did want to say was that Sheila's a lucky girl. And I think you're a pretty fortunate young man too, Gerald.
I know I am. This once, anyhow.
So, here's wishing the pair of you the very best that life can bring. Gerald and Sheila.
Yes, Gerald. Yes, Sheila, darling, our congratulations.
Thank you.
Eric?
All the best. She's got a nasty temper on her sometimes, but she's not really that bad. Good old Sheila.
Chump. I can't drink to this, can I? When do I drink?
You can drink to me.
All right, then. I drink to you, Gerald.
Thank you. And I drink to you and hope I can make you as happy as you deserve to be.
You be careful or I'll start weeping.
Well, perhaps this will help.
Oh, Gerald! Oh, you've got it! Is it the one you wanted me to have?
Yes, the very one.
Oh, look, Mummy, isn't it a beauty? Oh, darling.
Steady the buffs.
Now I really feel engaged.
So you ought to, darling. It's a lovely ring. Be careful with it.
Careful, I shall never let it out of my sight.
Now, Arthur, I think Sheila and I had better go into the drawing room. Leave you men to your cigars and
I just want to say this. Now, are you listening, Sheila? This concerns you too. And after all, I don't often make speeches,
I'm
as you know.
sorry, Daddy, I was listening.
I'm delighted about this engagement. And I hope it won't be too long before you're married. You'll be marrying at a very good time. Oh, yes, a very good time. At last, we're coming together to see that our interests, the interest of capital, are properly protected. We are in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity.
I believe you're right, sir.
Now, you young people, just listen to this. And remember what I'm telling you now. In 20 or 30 years, you may be giving a little party like this. Well, your son or daughter might be getting engaged. And I tell you, by that time, you'll be living in a world where they'll have forgotten all about these capital versus labour agitations. There's going to be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere.
Arthur.
Yes, I know, my dear, I know. I'm talking too much. But you youngsters, just remember what I said. We hard-headed, practical businessmen must say something sometime. And we don't guess. We've had experience. And we know.
Yes, of course, dear. Come along, Sheila. Don't keep Gerald in here too long. Eric, I want you a minute.
Very well, Mother.
Cigar?
No, thanks. Can't really enjoy them. I'll stick to cigarettes.
Well, you don't know what you're missing. Help yourself to port.
Thank you.
Oh, dear. By the way, now, there's something I'd like to mention, in strict confidence, while we're by ourselves. I have an idea that your mother, while she doesn't object to my girl, feels you might have done better for yourself socially.
No, I don't think she...
No, Gerald, that's all right. Don't blame her. Lady Croft comes from an old county family, landed people and so forth and so, well, it's only natural. But what I wanted to say is, there is a fair chance that I might find my way into the next honours list. Just a knighthood, of course.
Oh, I say, well, congratulations.
Well, I've had a hint or two. You see, I was Lord Mayor here 2 years ago when royalty visited us. And I've always been regarded as a sound party man, so I gather that there's a very good chance. So long as we behave ourselves, don't get into the police court or start a scandal.
Well, you seem to be a nice, well-behaved family.
Well, I think we are.
So if that's the only obstacle, sir, I think you might as well accept my congratulations now.
No, I couldn't do that. And don't say anything yet.
Not even to my mother. I know she'd be delighted.
Well, when she comes back, well, you might drop a hint. And you can promise her that we'll try to keep out of trouble during the next few months.
What's the joke? Started telling stories?
Oh, no. Want another glass of port, Eric?
Oh, yes, please. Mother says we mustn't stay too long, but I don't think it matters. I left them talking about clothes again. I think a girl never had any clothes before she gets married. Women are potty about them.
Oh, yes, but you've got to remember, my boy, that clothes mean something quite different to a woman. Not just something to wear, not only something to make them look prettier, but it's a sort of sign or token of their self-respect.
That's true.
Yes, I remember.
Well, what do you remember?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Sounds a bit fishy to me.
You don't know what some of these boys get up to nowadays. More money to spend and time to spare than I had when I was Eric's age. They worked as hard in those days, kept us short of cash. Though even then, we had a bit of fun sometimes.
I bet you did.
Oh, I don't want to lecture you two young fellas again, but what so many of you don't seem to understand now when things are so much easier is that a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself, and his family too, of course, when he has one. And so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm.
Very true.
But the way that some of these cranks talk and write now, and you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive. Community and all that nonsense. But you take my word for it, you youngsters, and I've learned in the good hard school of experience. A man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own, and...
Somebody at the front door.
Okay, let's start looking through this annotation. And as we do, it's really important to bear in mind that Gerald's family are socially superior to Birling's family. And throughout this section of Act 1, Birling is trying to impress Gerald, he's trying to solidify the relationship between Sheila and him, and in some ways, Birling sees Sheila marrying Gerald as a way of improving the social situation of his own family. This all links in with ideas around class, patriarchy, and in some ways social mobility. Birling wants to move up. Now we see this in the very first thing that he says. He tries to impress Gerald through his knowledge of port, and by buying the same port that Gerald's father drinks, this shows that he's copying their family in an effort to appear more sophisticated than maybe he actually is. We then see Sheila, in contrast to Birling, saying, "I'd hate you to know all about port," like one of these purple-faced old men, saying that to Gerald, showing that she doesn't want Gerald to turn into one of the men that Mr. Birling most admires. Now there is some irony within this, as Gerald will possibly become one of these purple-faced old men. He's on a trajectory to take over his family business, to become this rich, influential man. And we then see another aspect of Sheila's character. At this part of the play, she's rather childish, and she refers to Mrs. Birling as Mummy. Now this is quite a childish word, shows that she's potentially quite immature at this moment, and talks a little bit about the closeness of their relationship, that she still sees her mother as a really important figure in her life, but that she sees her from the perspective of a child. Now this will change, and I want you to note just now that there will be a contrast later in the play when she refers to Mrs. Birling as mother. This is around page 217. And by changing how she refers to Mrs. Birling, this shows her character grow, mature, but also shows distance within their relationship. So just bear in mind how that changes. We'll talk more about that when we get there. We then see a contrast between Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling. When enjoying the food, Birling asks Mrs. Birling, "Tell cook from me," showing that he wants to compliment the chef, that he feels that it's okay to be polite and respectful to his own staff. In contrast, Mrs. Birling says, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things," showing that she believes that you don't thank your workers. The idea that you pay them, they turn up, they do their job, you shouldn't have to talk to them, you shouldn't have to be polite to them, they should just be happy that they're employed. Now, this backs up the contrast between old money and new money, remembering that Mrs. Birling represents old money, that kind of money that has always been in your family, the kind of privilege that you've inherited and always lived. Mr. Birling, however, is very much new money. He's made his wealth recently and potentially lived a life within the lower classes before making all of his money. We then see some foreshadowing of an issue within Gerald and Sheila's relationship, and this is really, really subtle. And unless you look at the stage directions, you may not even notice it. But look at how Priestley directs the characters here. So while Gerald is trying to persuade Sheila that he's tried to be part of her family, as she does not reply with more insistence, he says, "Haven't I? You know I have." So this "with more insistence" shows that it's potentially been a struggle for Gerald to persuade Sheila that he is interested in her and her family. But by needing to persuade her that that's the case, there must have been some issue in the past. And we see that issue from Sheila pretty much straight away. She says, "Yes, except for all last summer when you never came near me and I wondered what had happened to you." Now the way that she's directed to deliver this, half serious, half playful, this duality talks about how she believes underneath that there is something serious going on. There is something that has genuinely worried her, but at the same time, she feels she needs to come across as playful, innocent, and childish. So she's trying to cover up her feelings a little here. But this establishes a historical issue within their relationship. Okay. In response to this accusation, Gerald says that he was working. And we see here Mrs. Birling try to defend him. She says that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business, talking about how men are the one that have to provide for the family, and women just have to get used to that. As she says here, you'll have to just get used to that. And now this explores the idea of gender, and in particular the role of women. That women have to just put up with the fact that their men will be working and absent. Now, as we'll find out, the men aren't always working. Interestingly, Sheila replies to that, "I don't believe I will," to say that she won't get used to it, that she'll find it difficult to get used to it. And I think this foreshadows contrast and potential conflict between Sheila and Sybil. This shows that their values on this matter are different, that Mrs. Birling believes it's most important for the men to earn money, whereas Sheila believes it's most important for the men to be present. She wants her husband to be there, not always away working. The tension here between Gerald and Sheila is broken when Eric suddenly guffaws. He suddenly bursts out with laughter. And this may be because he's drunk, it may be because he's young, but I think this also foreshadows that he understands the emptiness of their words, that he understands that Gerald, when he says, "Oh, I will be careful," won't. He's going to just carry on doing what he wants to do, and Sheila's just going to have to put up with that. I think Eric recognises that, and that's what makes him laugh. We then have just a brief reference to patriarchy in the upper class when Birling is talking about Gerald's family. He refers to them as Sir George and Lady Croft, just to reinforce the idea that they are from the top of the class structure. They are part of the establishment fully. And then we come to the beginning of Birling's big speech. Now there are quite a few points within this, so I'm just going to talk about a few of them. So to start with, just bear this in mind. When Birling says to Eric, "When you've a daughter of your own, you'll understand why." Just think, when we get to the end of the play, I'd like to return to this statement and think about Birling and his foreshadowing, and Birling and his particularly ironic statements. This is just something to bear in mind. We then have a reference to marriage. Birling says to Gerald, "You're just the kind of son-in-law I always wanted," showing that at this time, marriage was sometimes something you did to please your parents. And I want you to question that. Why is Sheila marrying Gerald? Does she marry him because she loves him, or does she marry him because she knows it will make her parents happy? Okay, and then we get more of an idea about Gerald's family being superior to the Birlings. Mr. Birling says Crofts Limited are both older and bigger than Birling and Company. So, him showing once more that Gerald's family are above the Birlings. And I think this also backs up the idea that Birling sees Gerald's family as a way to improve his own family. Now, this is a really key quotation next. So Birling talks about how Sheila and Gerald's marriage is going to be an opportunity for the two families to work together for lower costs and higher prices. This is a reference to capitalism. This is a reference to the idea that a capitalist wants to pay the lowest they can pay for materials and labour and charge the consumer as high a price as possible. This shows where Birling's values lie. Making money, that is his ultimate aim. And considering he's talking about the marriage here, is this what Birling sees the point of the marriage being? That he's going to be able to work with the Crofts and drive costs down through bulk buying and all of that kind of stuff, and charge more because of his association with them. And that's pretty dark when you think about it, that Birling is kind of selling his daughter off for a capitalist idea. Here's a nice point to make. Birling says that Sheila's a lucky girl to be with Gerald. Now, throughout the play, Birling is often wrong. The things that he says are often wrong. And returning to this statement, once we hear Gerald's story, we can see that he is wrong here. Sheila really isn't a lucky girl to be with Gerald. He's really not that nice a guy. We then have lots of typical family wedding stuff. The toast to Gerald and Sheila, showing that Birling's family is a normal family, and this is a very normal family thing to do. Then, after receiving congratulations, when imploring Eric to say something, he mentions, she's got a nasty temper sometimes, but she's not bad really. This shows the relationship between Eric and Sheila as very typical. They're very typical brother and sister. Eric falls out with her a little bit, they have some fights, but at the same time, this refers to Sheila later in the play. She does have a nasty temper. She does kind of lose it a little bit with some of the characters. J.B. Priestley has a really nice way of foreshadowing things throughout the play early on, and I think this is one of them. So everyone's making a toast, and Sheila asks, I can't drink. What do I drink to? And Gerald says, you can drink to me. Now this is another key quotation, and if Gerald comes up and gender comes up, it's a good point to make. This is a control statement. It's a power statement. He's saying, I am now the most important person in your life. You can toast me. And all of that links to the idea of patriarchy and the idea that men are in charge and that men in some ways control women. Okay, so then we have a further reference of the expectations of women through Sheila's stage direction, trying to be light and easy, that at this point she shouldn't be showing any emotion, that she should be trying to keep it together. We then have a further exploration of gender and particularly control within relationships. This also is a key quotation. Note this down. When being presented with the wedding ring, Sheila says, is it the one you wanted me to have? Now think about this. Sheila wasn't allowed to choose her own wedding ring. Gerald gave her the ring that he wanted her to have, indicating that she didn't really have any choice in the matter. And this is very strange, because typically a man would try and find out the ring that a woman wants to have and buy her the ring that she wants to have, rather than be giving her the one that he wants her to have. This again shows Gerald has control over Sheila and that he has power over her. And one of the key features of Gerald's character is wanting control and power over women. And we'll see that emerge when Gerald's story finally comes out. Now, as we move on, I want you to think about patriarchy. We talk about how that shows women controlled by men of power, but how is it developed through the rest of this section of Act 1? Here we have another piece of foreshadowing, and again, I'd like to compare the end of the play to the beginning of the play with this. Sheila says about the ring, I'll never let it go out of my sight for an instant. I mean, what might that be foreshadowing? If we're thinking about characters changing, if we're thinking about characters' attitudes changing, potentially Sheila is going to let this ring out of her sight. Mrs. Birling smilingly says, well, it came just at the right moment. Now, there is some ambiguity in this statement. Is she talking about the right moment of the night? That Gerald has produced this ring as the meal is finishing, as everyone is happy, as everyone is relaxing? Or is she saying at the right moment in their relationship? Is she saying that if Gerald hadn't asked Sheila to marry him, then maybe Sheila would have gotten rid of him? Maybe Sheila would have left him? I think if you're going to think about it from the second point, then again, that backs up that Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling want this marriage to go ahead, with all of the links to social improvement that would come of it. Okay, then we get the next big speech from Mr. Birling. Now, this whole speech is around capitalism And this indeed is Mr. Birling's main characteristic. He's a capitalist who is anti-worker. He's pro-profit. So he says here, I speak as a hard-headed businessman. Key quotation there. Note that one down. That is everything you need to know about Mr. Birling. He's hard-headed. He makes what he thinks are difficult decisions, but at the same time he's quite rigid in his thought, and he's a businessman. Everything that he does to serve business. Now, bear in mind that this play was set in 1912. A lot of the things that Mr. Birling is going to talk about in this speech refer to global events of 1912. And he describes them as silly, pessimistic talk. Now, the first of those events, he talks about last month, just because the miners came out on strike, there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble in the near future. And this refers to the national coal strike of 1912, when miners went on strike and there was an energy shortage within the country. Now, this strike was over workers' rights, in particular, the right to be paid a decent wage. And indeed, through striking, the miners were able to gain a minimum wage for miners. So this strike that Mr. Birling is talking about actually led to the improvement of workers. He then says, we've passed the worst of it, which absolutely the country had not at that point. You know, there will be further industrial action, there will be further strikes, there will be further shortages, particularly going into World War One. But he's kind of blinkered the realities of the situation and says, we employees at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected. Again, that's another key quotation that talks about Birling being a capitalist. And this idea that he wants to protect the interests of capital, this shows that he believes that money is more important than people, that the country needs to protect the interests of money, that we should put the economy above protecting people. And that is a very, very capitalist point of view. And indeed, if we were to take a Marxist perspective on this, then we need to think about Mr. Birling here is saying that he's glad that him and people of business control the means of production, that he believes that class conflicts will be over because the rich are supremely powerful. Bearing in mind again that Priestley was a socialist and he would have been absolutely opposed to this point of view. And we then have Eric bring up the idea of war, and he's talking about World War One. So bear in mind, World War One was 1914 to 1918. This play is set just before World War One. I'll look at Mr. Birling's response to Eric questioning about World War One. Birling says, you know, you'll hear some people say that war's inevitable, and to that I say, fiddlesticks. This shows that Mr. Birling is always wrong. You know, the war did happen. He says the Germans don't want war. The Germans absolutely did want war. You know, they were prepared to go to war. Okay, so as I've said before, Birling is often wrong about things that are happening in the world. And as we look at the next set of statements that he makes, we're going to see that he really, really is completely clueless about the world and about the things that are happening in it. So I think it's important for us to think about why. Why is Birling so wrong about the things that are happening around him? And I think it's for this reason. Birling is ignorant of the real world because he is stuck in a bubble created by wealth. And he's surrounded himself by wealthy people. He's surrounded himself by people who are businessmen, who are the leaders of industry, and who are very rich. And so he only thinks of the world from the perspective of a rich person. Now, this perspective on the world leads to a thing called hubris. Now, hubris is excessive pride or self-confidence that leads to a downfall. So it's like saying, I'm the best footballer in the world, I can score every single goal on the pitch, and then going to take a penalty, and because you've boasted so much, you miss it. That's the definition of hubris. And certainly within this play, Mr. Birling suffers from hubris. He believes that he is brilliant. He believes that his life is brilliant and that he could do no wrong. But it's that belief that makes his downfall, when the inspector interrogates him, even more painful. You know, he has to face the fact that he isn't a nice person, and he has to face the consequences of the way that he chooses to behave. Okay, Birling continues to talk about the world situation in 1912, repeating the idea that he is a hard-headed practical man of business. You know, he repeats this a lot. It's kind of like his mantra. Okay, so he talks about how technological advancement is going to make war impossible. Again, this is Birling being wrong. He talks about how in a year or two we'll have aeroplanes that will be able to go anywhere, and those aeroplanes will become bombers and fighters. He talks about how the automobile is making headway, bigger and faster all the time. This talks about tanks and military vehicles. We then have the most obvious piece of dramatic irony of all time, Mr. Birling talking about the Titanic, describing it as unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. This again is Mr. Birling just being wrong. At the same time, this is Mr. Birling reflecting the hubris of the time. But in commenting on the Titanic, this is dramatic irony because we as the audience know that the Titanic sank. In the same way that we know that World War I happened, that the aeroplanes that were being developed were bombers and fighter planes, and all that kind of stuff. He says the war absolutely will not happen, and says in 20 or 30 years' time, let's say in 1940. Now in 1940, World War II was happening. Now bear in mind this play was first performed in 1946. The audience absolutely would have known that by Birling referring to 1940, he was inadvertently talking about World War II. And he says that in the future, that the world will have forgotten all these capital versus labour agitations and all the silly little war scares. Again, he's wrong about that. Capital versus labour agitations. This was a massive factor in Labour taking power in 1945. And it was something that led to an increased amount of unions. So these are groups of people within workplaces designed to protect each other, and a much more socialist society. So again, Birling is wrong. We then have a nice literary reference. Birling mentions two socialist writers, Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. Now these are important writers to talk about, but particularly H.G. Wells. So H.G. Wells was a friend of J.B. Priestley, and Wells wrote The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, all of those books. Now through his stories, H.G. Wells made some very accurate predictions for the 20th century. So when Birling talks about how we shouldn't listen to H.G. Wells, he's saying we shouldn't listen to somebody who was much more accurate in his predictions than himself. Again, it's Birling being wrong. He further repeats, we hard-headed practical businessmen. He repeats it again for the third time, showing that it is really, really important to his character. You really must make sure that you've written that down. If Mr. Birling comes up, we hard-headed practical businessmen is a really easy quotation to remember. Okay, we now see some of Birling's full embrace of the patriarchal system. We see him degrade his daughter. He says to Gerald that he understands that Lady Croft, while she doesn't object to my girl, feels she might have done better for yourself socially. And in doing so, he shows Gerald that he recognises that his family are from a lower social class than Gerald's family. And when Gerald, rather embarrassed, tries to, get Mr. Birling to change the topic, Birling says, no, it's fine. Don't blame her. She comes from an old county family, landed people. This is him directly saying that they are from old money, and that they are very representative of the patriarchy, that they are the ones with the power. And he tries to reassure Gerald by discussing his own potential social progression. He talks about how he's potentially getting a knighthood. This is an increase of his power. We then have a little bit more foreshadowing. He says that he will be getting his knighthood if he doesn't get into police court or start a scandal. This is ironic because they do start a scandal. That's kind of the rest of the play, and it foreshadows that a little bit. Now here's an interesting use of language. Gerald says, you seem to be a nice, well-behaved family, not you are a nice, well-behaved family. Is this Gerald referring to some sort of artifice? Some sort of surface reality where underneath they're not a nice, well-behaved family? Yeah, as we'll find out later in the play, they're not really. And this is backed up through Birling. We think we are, not we are. So bear these things in mind. Even at this point in the play, there are some slight indications that the Birlings aren't really that nice a family. We then have Eric re-entering the scene, and his drinking is what is brought up. He helps himself to a drink. Yes, please, when asked if he wants another glass of port. We get an understanding that Eric maybe has a bit of a problem with drink. Then Eric talks more about the role of women. We're coming back from being in the room with Mrs. Birling and Sheila. He says, I left them talking about clothes again. Showing that men's opinion of women at this point in time, where they only really care about clothes, showing that their conversation has been something rather light and not really that serious. This is then backed up by Birling saying that for women, clothes are a sort of sign or token of their self-respect. This shows that Birling believes that women need clothes to feel good. Now we could analyse this from a couple of perspectives. We can think about it from a feminist perspective. This shows attitudes towards women, in particular Birling's attitude that women need clothes to feel good about themselves. But at the same time, we could analyse it from a Marxist perspective. We could think about, is this a comment on consumerism? That Birling is saying that women need to spend their money on clothes to feel good. That women need to consume these products to feel good. Either way, it shows that Birling has an attitude that women are rather shallow and vain and only care about their appearances rather than what they actually have to offer to the world and what they're like as people. Then a little bit of foreshadowing for Eric's story. The conversation is moving on to women, and Eric very eagerly says, yes, I remember, but he checks himself. This foreshadows that Eric has potentially had contact with a woman, but he doesn't really want to talk to them about it. Now this links with Eva and the final revelation we get with Eric's story. Birling then establishes some of the conflict between the old and the young. He discusses what life was like for him when he was a young man. He talked about how they worked as hard in those days and kept us short of cash. This shows that, yeah, indeed, Birling used to be working class. It also shows that Birling believes that Eric is privileged and is in some way wasting that privilege, or at least he doesn't appreciate that privilege. Now the next quotation is particularly important for Birling and discusses social responsibility. He says that nowadays a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself and his family too. This is the opposite of social responsibility. Now, social responsibility is the idea that everybody in society should look after everybody else, that we should always be trying to support people around us that are less fortunate and are struggling. Now, Birling is the opposite. Birling says that we should look after ourselves, that we should look after our own families, whereas social responsibility says that we should look after others. And this is backed up again when he says that, but the way some of these cranks talk right now, you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else. It's as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. This is the individual versus the society. Society will be community, and Birling shows that he believes that is nonsense. Individual is the man. And he says here, he backs that up, a man has to mind his own business and look after himself. So a man should keep himself to himself and focus only on his family and not look after anybody else within society. This is then interrupted with a sharp ring of a front doorbell. Now, this is the inspector arriving. Think of the symbolism within that. The inspector is cutting Birling off as he's saying community and society are nonsense, all that matters is the individual. Now, the inspector has exactly the opposite values. He has exactly the opposite beliefs. He believes we should all look after each other. He believes in society. So by interrupting Mr. Birling's speech at this point, he cuts him off from this line of thought. Now, as the inspector comes in, Birling is going to have to try and justify these points of view. Think about the symbolism of the inspector, who holds the exact opposite views to Birling, interrupting Birling at this point in his speech. Birling is just saying that community is nonsense, the individual is what is most important, and that's the point where the inspector interrupts and is about to come in to the play and show the Birlings that he feels the exact opposite view is correct in society. Okay, but we'll look at that in the next video. All right, that's it for that part of the act. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye bye.